What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Conspiracy or Just a Coincidence. I am Jack Allen. Go follow me at Kojak Podcast if you haven't followed me. Rumble. Oh my God. First of all, before I do this, Rumble, anybody, any of my contacts at Rumble, quick tip. If you're gonna allow people to restream on Rumble, please don't make them create a new RTMP blah 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 stuff to link every single episode. It's infuriating, it's frustrating, and I please fix this. This is ridiculous. No one else does this. But anyway, I am Jack Allen, like I said, from Conspiracy or Just a Coincidence. This is part 2 of Politics of Heroin. Now, we had a small group last night. I had to redo it. I was exhausted. I was falling asleep. I don't know why I was so gosh darn tired, but I was exhausted and super unhappy with the way the show went out. So I'm redoing it again. So if you were here last night, it is the same show, but with a better Jack Allen, with a more energized. I drank 2 Celsius today. I've been trying to cut down on my caffeine intake because I've been consuming some ungodly amount, like 500 milligrams of caffeine a day. Too much. I've been trying to cut down. Yesterday, I drank 1, was done at noon, and was exhausted. So if you were here last night, thank you. This is going to be the same show, but it's going to be a much better show. That I can promise you. My wife, even she said, "Go to bed." She said, "You look horrible," and she was right. She was absolutely right. So I was actually not even going to do it live. My lovely wife said, "Do it live. Who cares? People that saw it already, they don't need to watch it." So we're going to redo this show. But Bud Sport, thank you on the congrats on the 6 years, buddy. I really appreciate that. Yesterday was my 6-year anniversary of the last time I shot some heroin and smoke some crack. So it's been a long time. Best decision I've ever made in my life. I thank God every day, dude. I thank God every day for all of the blessings that I have. Skeptic, what's up, dude? I missed you yesterday. And but yes, so I apologize for the people that were in the chat yesterday. It was not my normal Jack Allen self. So I really do. I was embarrassed. I was just so disappointed in myself. So that's why I'm doing this again. So maybe you were here yesterday. If you were, I'll do a better job explaining of what we were doing last night. So today, this is part 2, Politics of Heroin. I did part 1 about a month ago. If you're interested in the opiates, heroin, opium, in the sense of what it means to society, what it means to humanity, go check that one out first. It's a great book. The author, though, I did research because I love the book so much, and he's this like hardcore socialist, which not that just makes any of things he says less true, but I did find that interesting. But yeah, so we're going to do part 2 here because like I said, I was so unhappy with the way the show went out. I couldn't even publish it. I deleted it off everything. So I wanted to start again. So if you didn't check out part 1, go check it out. Like I said, if this topic interests you, drugs, international drug trafficking, it's an amazing book. Or if you just don't even want to listen to me, read the book because it's fascinating. So last episode, though, we touched on a whole bunch of things. But basically what we were talking about is just how the international drug trade it's a created thing. It is not just a free market crony capitalism thing. It's a planned destruction. It's a planned attack. It's a psychological warfare, if you will, against the populace. And so go check that out. I kind of went over, and I'll do this very briefly. I did this last show just so you have a timeline of opium. So opium been around since ancient times. Alexander the Great, Marcus Aurelius, he was an opium addict. And so it's been around, since BC times, right? Never on an industrial scale. And that all changes in around the 1600s. When Portuguese explorers, they make it to I believe they start in India, but they start selling opium to China. Eventually, Portugal gets ousted by the British, And the East India Company, British military, what have you, they obviously they conquer, they colonize India, and India becomes the major growth spot of opium. So for about 200 years, opium, 57% of Britain, England's tax revenue was coming from opium. 57%. That was the highest. Other countries, Portugal, the Dutch, they were looking at about 19, 20%. But can you imagine any commodity that is bringing a country 57% of its tax revenue? So you have to view it at this time in the 1800s that opium and heroin wasn't viewed as the way it is today. And we're going to kind of get into that. It was a commodity. It was like coffee. It was like tea. And the real reason why the British went balls deep into it is, and Europe, is because they're losing all their silver to the East and gold because they're buying silks and ceramics and fancy art projects, whatever, what have you. And they need a way to get that silver back. So the way they get that silver back is opium. And so after that happens, there's about 200 years, millionaires are made. The Russell family, the Taft family, the Roosevelt family, Kennedy family, he was an opiate, but all of these American blue blood names, billionaires, millionaires of the day, a lot of them built their fortunes on the opium trade. And this was because one of the reasons why was British was having this big moral conundrum with all their Puritans, like, oh, this isn't nice to do this to these countries. America at this time, they capitalism, baby, it's free trade. God wants you to have free trade. Doesn't matter who you hurt. And so a lot of Americans made their millions the same exact way. They did the exact same thing. Hey, Annika, what's going on? Hope you're doing well. Sorry, I'm just reading Skeptic and Buds. How much you buy into the theory of China pumping Fetty into the country as payback? And Wes, I'm sorry, you were here yesterday. So Wes, it's going to be a repeat. I apologize, buddy. So I was just so exhausted, dude, as I'm sure you could tell. But that's a great question, bud. And I thought about that so many times. Is that the reason why fentanyl is pumped into America through China? I don't believe so. I believe the Chinese are just like Americans. They want to make ways to make money. And something interesting is, I don't know if you guys know what things called research chemicals are. So research chemicals, they became popular probably right around where I was in high school. I remember people talking about poppers, very big in the homosexual community, but their research chemicals are just basically very close analogs to drugs that we currently have. Sometimes they're actually drugs that are not approved in America, but approved in another country. But because, so say, I'm pulling this out of my butt. You won 2CB. Bud said there's so many different, but I'm just making this up, guys. So say Xanax, right? Xanax you need a prescription for in the United States. But and there is some rules, but it's a very gray area as long as it's not for human consumption. So there is this a huge RC, that's research chemical community that so the point I was trying to make with that was that's what China is known for that. So all the RC chemical stuff that comes from China. And the moment though that the Chinese government, because they are anti-drug, Mao Zedong eliminated that, China was one of every 5 males was addicted to heroin in China for 150 years. So they're very strict. They know it's not good for their country. We're going to get into this even more about how the biggest drug dealer organizations, the original guys, they refused. They would not sell opium to their home country. So do I think that China is using this as payback? It's a possibility, but I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think if anyone, I'd blame the American government, because if you are a leader or president, whatever, this is your country. Are you going to, and you have more, you can hack every Alexa, cell phone, Ring doorbell, anything, Bluetooth, TVs. if you wanted to stop something, they would stop it. I mean, just think of, I always tell this story, guys, and I don't know if I've told this story before, but during my drug days, I would find, in Philadelphia, people lose credit cards all the time. And so I found a credit card the one time, bought some sick Tims, because when I thought I was a gangster thug G, I bought some sweet Tims, some cool Nike windbreaker jackets. It was probably like $200 worth. And that was it. The card gets canceled. Nothing happens. And then this happens to me again later. And on this one, I spend, I think I get about $800 worth of stuff. Not a lot, like from pawn shops. I used it, sneakers. And I work, I work all cash business with this guy on South Street. I've moved like 4 times in Philadelphia. And where I was using the credit card was it was on South Side of Philly, South Street. I lived in West Philly. And one day I was smoking a cigarette outside, and this black guy comes up to me and he says, "Yo, give me a smoke." And I'm broke, because I'm a drug addict. And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I got to talk to you." And I was like, "What?" And so he said, "The police came into our store and they were looking for you. They're asking about you." I was like, "What?" And no name, no ID, nothing like that. And so now I'm scared. 2 weeks later, 6:30, 7 a.m. in my apartment in Philadelphia, this shit apartment in West Philly, and I get a real loud bang on the door, and I don't open the door right away because I'm like, who that? I'm not friends with anybody who's knocking on my door. Door gets kicked down, and it was the police. And they had a drawing of me, which was funny because on the previous night, I was on the subway and I gave a homeless guy $1, drew a picture of me that I hung on my wall. That looked nothing like me, but the police photograph that they had drawn of me looked exactly like me. The point that I'm making with this is that the police have every possibility. If they want to stop drugs, if they want to stop anything, they could do it in a heartbeat. Because like I said, $800 worth of stuff, and they were able to find me with no identification, no name. I mean, yes, I had a criminal record at that time, no fingerprints. They were able to, I had just moved. The way that they were able to find me, kick in my door, have all this stuff. I'm saying that, and this was in 2014 or something like that. So I'm just saying this to prove to you that if the government wants to stop something, they'll stop it. Like I was a drug user. I was broke, but yet they kicked down a door for 800. They trashed my apartment. They ripped out every single drawer. They destroyed it, just looking for stuff that I may have bought. When I did get arrested at that point, I had sweatpants that I used for the credit card, and being, just withdrawing and stuff. I made up some lie like, "Oh, my friend owed me money. It was his mom's credit card," he said, blah, 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 blah. And they took all of my clothes, which was everything that I was wearing. And I had to wear lost and found stuff my first day getting processed and stuff like that into the jail. So I'm just saying that long-winded story. The point of that story was that if drugs was an actual priority for the American government, for the DEA, what have you, they could stop it. They choose not to. That's the point I'm trying to make. So anyway, Britain and Europe for 200 years, it's a commodity. They're making millions, if not billions of dollars on the opium trade. Rates, started out before Britain got involved. I have the numbers later in the notes. I'm going to kind of make it up. Let's say 200 kilos a year they're making of opium. By the time after the British had been there for 100 years, that number was getting up to something like 85,000 tons of opium were being produced a year. So you can see just huge, 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 huge push. Afghanistan, Vietnam. Weird how all the places we have wars, there's opium being grown. I'm sure that's just totally by chance. And I'm just sorry. I just wanted to read Bud's comment here. It is almost like the U.S. government is allowing the epidemic to happen to get this bad to kill off the middle and lower class. Agreed. There's a reason why they're doing it. It's like Brave New World, Soma. You get enough people to take drugs, to ignore the horrible pitfalls that we see in this world, all the injustices. It's a lot easier to control a populace when they're addicted to something, whether it's opiates, whether it's heroin, because when you're withdrawing, you will do whatever you need to stop withdrawing. And like pick up credit cards that you found on the ground and then go pawn those goods. But anyway, okay. Now we're back. Now I'm back. Oh wait, I'm sorry. Bud was Trank and Meat Tenderizer. G Street was straight dope. Now it's Trank. Yeah, in Philadelphia, where I copped, I was there, for about 10 years or 8 years, 2012 to 2011 to 20 or to 2000. What's 6 years ago? 17, 16. And right at the end of my reign there, when I started out, it was always heroin, $10 a bag. And towards the end of my drug usage there, a change started happening. It left from the usually brown, but or at least when you mix it, brown heroin, and it was becoming something that we all know now called fentanyl, which was actually cheaper, $5 a bag. Scariest part is addicts, you hear, oh, everyone's dying off of the Gucci bags. You would say, oh, a normal person would say, let's not buy the Gucci bags. A drug addict says, I got to get that Gucci bag. And eventually something came out called carbofentanyl, which is even stronger than fentanyl. I don't know if you guys ever seen the graph. We'll do a salt shaker. 100 grains of salt, that's heroin. 10 grains of salt, that's fentanyl. Carbofentanyl is 1 grain of salt. And so you can see how dangerous this would be, because if these aren't scientists mixing these drugs up, right? But now in Philadelphia, as Bud mentioned, the new thing is this thing called Trank. So it's fentanyl, which is extremely potent, obviously overdoses all the time. And now they've added this veterinarian thing called Trank, or they call it Trank. I don't know what the actual drug is called. I bet Wes or Bud knows the actual name of it. But and I'm sure you've seen the videos. They look like zombies, the nodding off, the standing up. That's not a new phenomenon in any way, shape, or form. But this Trank is so bad for you that it eats away your skin. It eats away. You get wounds. I mean, it's worse and worse. And again, I was friends with when I got clean, I worked at a gym. I was friends with this undercover drug cop from Philadelphia. Shout out Jeff. He doesn't listen to the show, but he was a good guy. And I asked Jeff because, like I said, I stopped going in 2016 to this one of the largest open air drug markets in the country. And I said, how is it down there? And he said, it's worse than it's ever been. So that's why you see all those videos of the people, the zombies, people call them and all stuff like that. It's total free for all. Not that it wasn't a free for all when I was there. I remember, I was getting high in my car. I just copped. A cop pulled up right next to me. And if you were in a suburb, anywhere else, you would be pulled over. The cop rolled down his window. I rolled down mine. He said, "You all right?" And I'm terrified, right? And I say, "Yeah." He says, "All right, be safe," and just drove away. And now these days, they don't arrest any drug users. They don't even go for dealers. They basically ride their little bicycles around just to act like they're doing something. But that it's going to keep growing. As you guys know, I mean, my wife and I, we talk about this all the time. Where we live, we've now lived here, I think about 3 or 4 years in this house. We lived in the area before, but these last 3 years, and I don't want to blame Biden or whatever, but it has gotten exponentially worse, right? I mean, there's homeless people everywhere, and I am in a suburb outside of the city of Philadelphia. There is a train there. I have this guy, this African-American guy who mentally ill beyond belief. He's always walking around, and I don't let my wife take out our dog at night anymore because of this guy. He will do this. Is my dog so friendly? He knows Charlie's name because my Liv will say, "Charlie, come here. And Charlie wants and this guy again, who's a homeless, probably mentally ill, will start trying to coax Charlie to come to him. He'll say, "Come, Charlie, come here, Charlie, come here." I mean, that's so these last 3 years, the point of this is Kensington is getting worse. Drugs are getting more prevalent, more acceptable, more on and on and on. And that's how Kensington is at. Well, and people live down there. It's a whole world. It's just it's scary. It's a very sad, depressing place. Okay. All right. Back to finishing the opium story in the 1900. So with 1900 hits, the Puritans in Britain, they're saying this is morally incorrect. We shouldn't be doing this. It's kind of spreads all over America. In 1904, they create I think it was the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. It might have been something else. I think it was something else. And they called that. It became so corrupted, so much bribery. They changed the name to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And then in 1912 or 1914, America passes something called the Harrison Drug Act. And the Harrison Drug Act was the first prohibition, real drug law. Prior to this time, shockingly, more women, housewives, were addicted to opiates than men. Probably one of the only times that will ever happen in history. Boredom, at home, unfulfilling, whatever, what have you. And so once these became, so the next law was you had to get a prescription from a doctor to get opium, because prior to that, you could just buy it at any store. And the Harrison Drug Act really was the first start of the prohibition of the narcotics. I also, last thing, we talked about this last episode, but I just find it so important. So all these, these patents were blown, out to wazoo, tons of patents on miracle cures. All of them contained opium, cocaine, for babies, for whatever, whatever. Jack Allen's miracle cure, and I would patent it, advertise it in the newspaper. The largest advertisers of these patented opiate products that were addicting Americans definitely didn't say, "Don't take this every day because you're going to withdraw." Instead, they would put these ads in. Did maybe the New York Times say, "Hey, we're seeing some issues with this"? No, they said nothing bad about these snake oils, opium drugs. Why? Because these companies that were making these snake oil salesmen, opium dealings or whatever drugs, were the largest advertisers of the newspapers. So history rhymes. We always say this, Fox News, New York Times, they're not going to attack Pfizer. They're not going to attack GSK. They're not going to attack AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson. Why? They're their largest advertisers. So how can you have a true story? And this was the same way back then. So anyway, Harrison Drug Act passes, and this creates a black market. An underworld now starts to be forming. Not that there weren't gangs prior to this, but it starts the internet, kind of the drug trafficking aspect of this. And so and I just want to, because I just want to start from, I know I'm doing a recap, so I just want to make sure I have my note on the right spot here so we can get right into it. Here we go. Perfect. So at the time though, so 1914, so the early at post World War I, which heroin was really, addiction rates, heroin rates, very, very, very low. But post World War I, underworld happens now. And everyone thinks, when you think of the mafia, when you think of organized crime, mafia, that is the first thing that comes to everyone's mind. You think of Al Capone, you think of Vito Genovese, you think of all the mobsters, all that kind of stuff. You would be wrong. The first drug dealers, were the Jewish gangsters. People, not specifically, but people like Meyer Lansky, Waxy Gordon, on and on. Mickey Cohen, all these organized crime bosses. Again, Hollywood would tell you they are Italian, but they're not. They were Jewish gangsters. And I always found that interesting. And the Jewish gangsters were the ones that dominated the heroin trade. And we'll get to the statistic, and so I'm going to repeat it twice, but in 1920 something, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, they did a study in New York City of the 256 biggest drug dealers in New York City of heroin. And the numbers break down, and I'll correct myself if I'm incorrect here on somewhere. 140 of them Jewish, 60 of them Italian, 10 of them Greek, and 5, I forget, black, maybe something like that. So doesn't that statistic blow your mind? Hollywood, obviously, we know who dominates Hollywood. Many Zionists, many people of Jewish origin. So you could see why they're not going to highlight that it was actually their group that started, dominated, controlled the opiate and illicit international drug market. So I found that statistic fascinating. So that was kind of part one. Hopefully that was a good recap. I just want to read my little comments here because I got so many nice people in here. Let me see. Mother's Little Helpers. Yes, Skeptic. Yes, exactly, dude. Bud says, up until the 70s, you could get meth to shoot in nasal spray at Walgreens. Through the 90s, we still ran ads saying opiates weren't addictive or cause withdrawals. Yes, Oxycontin, right? That's what their big thing is. Oh my God, they said the same thing for heroin too. It's perfect. It's actually non-addictive. How doctors remind to advertise cigarettes. The Italian mom hated drugs for a long time. Yes, bud. And we're going to get into, I'm sorry. I got to say it now because we're going to get in the notes later. But so 1920s, like I said, Jewish gangsters run the heroin trade. Why were they running the heroin trade? Because prior to World War II and significantly after post-World War I, Sicilian mafia, the Corsican mafia, they had, so shockingly, morals and ethics. They refused. They mainly focused on racketeering, on like bribery, corruption, all kind of gambling. They would kill any of their brothers for selling drugs. Kill them. It was illegal to them. They looked down on it. They thought it was disgusting. They thought it was evil. And so it's just something that I found fascinating, that in your mind, when you hear organized crime, when you hear mafia, when you hear drug dealing, whatever, you think of the mob. And 99% of America would never guess who actually ran the mob. And Meyer Lansky, who we're going to get into in a second as well, he ran the Italian mafia. He was the boss. His best buddy was Lucky Luciano, I'm jumping all over. We're going to get to this, who created the modern day commission, the family. His boss was Meyer Lansky, who would escape to Israel as a retirement. Because most countries, they love having former murder gangsters. But Arnold Rothstein, so many gangsters that were Jewish that no one ever talks about. And I always found that interesting, that we highlight Vito Genovese, John Gotti, Al Capone, but no mention of Meyer Lansky, and no mention of all these people that were not of Italian descent. So at the end of World War II, heroin addiction, guys, is literally in shambles. It's done. It's gone for. It was almost eradicated. Could you believe that? Eradicated. And yes, even the mafia had standards. Oh, my wife's going to take care of my dinner. Thank you, my love. Thank you. You are so kind. Jewish Navy and some bootleg booze in Westlake, Ohio. Could you elaborate, Carl? I don't know what that, I don't know. I understand bootleg booze in Westlake, Ohio, but could you elaborate on that for me, please? They portrayed that in the Wes, my boy. He's always got a good thing, so we have to read his comment. They portrayed that right in The Sopranos. Italians were the puppets and the bosses were the small caps. Very true. And it is true, though. I'm not, people, that's anti-Semitic, blah, blah, blah. No, it's a fact. It's a fact. And this has nothing to do. To the same way, I would never say all Italians are in the mafia. I would never say all Jews are criminal gangsters, right? These pathetic, disgusting ways to label, to hide truth. It makes me sick. It makes me sick. The Sackler family, another great point. Ashley, great point. The Sackler family. Oh, did the Sackler family, or did they got in trouble, right? For pushing, promoting, lying about OxyContin? No, they didn't. They just Purdue Pharma just went bankrupt, had to pay billions. Did that hurt the Sackler family billions? No, it didn't. Wonder why that was. Oh, we had no control over what they were doing, right? F you guys. But so anyway, opium addiction, lowest of the low post World War II. Oh, sorry. Here, I just wanted to read Carl's message here because I was interested in that. Yes, I detail in mail. Don't know what that means, but they delivered booze from Canada to Ohio across Lake Erie in the 20s and 30s. Very interesting, Carl. And I've always wondered, this is Bud, I've always wondered if the mob stayed away from the opiates due to the knowledge from their CIA ties, big pharma, always in bed together. Very possible. Very possible. Then what makes the people think McCoys are animals? Oh, Wes, you cracked me up. You cracked me up. So the reason why, though, heroin, drug usage, all that kind of stuff is collapsing after post-World War II is all of the security measures during the war to prevent infiltration. So addicts were forced to stop during the war. Shocking with, there's intense patriotism, nationalism, blah, 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 belonging. Consumer demand literally almost disappeared. And this is because most addicts, just like myself, once you're a drug addict, you need a hobby, you need a purpose, you lose these purposes. And so World War II is a great way to get off of heroin because, one, you're not getting the product, it's poor product. And two, you find your purpose here. Your country needs you. Maybe you sign up to the military, whatever you may have you. But anyway, so syndicates, though, were completely dismantled during the war and pre-war, and they would have been decimated if there was a little more effort, even by just local police. Talk about how I overcame addiction. You're very sweet. I don't think many people, Ashley, would be interested in that. The quickest version is I just got just enough was enough. I've loving, the most amazing parents. My dad listens to this show. People that my dad was going to be a minister. I mean, he is the most honest, kind, loving man in the world. My mom was the third grade school teacher, the sweetest lady in the world. Sweet, sweet woman. I have no sad story. I have no reason why I became a drug addict. I think a lot had to do with confidence. I loved Biggie Smalls. I loved rap music. I wanted to be a gangster. I didn't feel, I guess, confident and masculine enough. And that was no fault to my parents of their own. I think it was just the time, right? Like I wanted girls to like me. I wanted to be popular. And I always joke with my wife, I was a little popular. I won best dressed, second best eyes, second best smile in my 1,000 people graduating class. So you guys are talking to high school royalty a little bit here. Lightly joking here. Anyway, so yeah, my wife just laughed. She laughed out loud when I just said that. She's just jealous because her school, she had like 200 people and she didn't win best dressed. Isn't that right? Anyway, 1930s though, dope was coming to America, mostly from China, some from from Marseille and the Corsicans. The last wartime seizure of heroin took place in 1940. So 5 years before the war ended, 42 kilograms of heroin were discovered in San Francisco. But quality continued to plummet during the war. Like by the end of the war, the only heroin you can get in America was this black tar Mexican heroin, which now is, I've had that before. It literally looks like a resin ball. Now it's high quality. It's just as good of quality as the powder. I don't know why it's black tar. It's a less step. It's only, you have to shoot it unless you do other things to it. But yeah, so that it was less than 3% pure, which was totally against what was going on prior to that, because you're getting like pure heroin back in the early days, maybe 50%, but 3%. So that doesn't get you high. It just gets you angry. And so then the Federal Bureau of Narcotics reported that there was only 20,000 heroin addicts left in the United States during World War II. 20,000. Today, I think it's something around 15 million addicts. And then so post-war China, World War II ends, right? All of our heroin's coming from China. Let's keep that going. Issue. Mao Zedong and the People's Revolution take over. And when Mao comes into power, his peasant armies basically killed, arrested, destroyed all the traffickers in China. And so the Corsican syndicates, they struggled since now they don't have their main supplier. A lot of the top Corsican mob bosses, they allied with the Nazis. So they're either dead or in exile. Sicilian mafia had been smashed beyond repair because of Mussolini's police for 15 years. They were surviving in the mountains of Sicily, and that was it. They had lost all power. So you have the perfect storm. The biggest smugglers, Corsicans, Sicilians, done. China, the biggest producer, done. You just have Mexico. And so if you have nothing left, right? You have nothing left. So you literally, the US government could have totally eliminated heroin addiction in America, but they didn't do it. Now, why didn't they do it? We're going to get into that as well. Oh, Dave, I miss you, Dave. I hope you're doing well, buddy. I really do. And Carl, yeah, that'd be a lot of fun, dude. I think that'd be a fun time. Do you happen to know the story of how, where, and when the first IV heroin use was? I don't know the exact story, but the reason why it switched to IV drug usage was because the heroin was so pure. I mean, guys, like it makes me smile, but it was so pure. The original, from during the British opium smoking, when they finally started making into heroin. I mean, we're talking, guys, like 90, 80% pure. The mob was actually the first to really start cutting it down. But once they started, the quality started to drop, you couldn't sniff it to get high anymore. And hypodermic needles had just come out around this time. And so people switched to shooting dope anyway. And Mussolini was based, dude. He not only kicked out Crowley, ended Freemasonry, ended the mob. So history always lies. And I'm sure he had done many very evil things, just like everybody else. But yeah. So heroin addiction's about to end. Your brothers, your countrymen, your friends, family, you're about to change the world, change the country. And what happens? The OSS says, wait a second, guys, wait a second. I have an idea. Let's call it Paul Helliwell. And so what do they decide to do? They say, let's actually revive these international narcotic dealers. So the CIA, they had willingness to ally with any anti-communist alliances with drug dealers, knowingly to create a significant role in sustaining the global narcotics industry. So the OSS, through the Office of Naval Intelligence, allies with the mafia in 1943 to combat the growing Communist Party in Italy and Sicily. This is the same excuse the CIA will use for working with the Corsican Mafia to break the hold of the Communist Party and to end these dock strikes. And so what were these dock strikes? The dock strikes started 1950. And the reason why it was so important to the Americans is, like I said, communism is growing, especially in Corsica. But the reason why these was because we had just signed the Marshall Plan. And now the Marshall Plan, we're going to help rebuild Europe, guys. We're going to change it. We're going to make it all better. Is that why we gave billions of dollars to Western Europe? To help everybody? No. It was to control communism from growing on the continent. And so because this Marseille was one of the key docks to get the Marshall Plan cash and pallets and food out, and they're on strike, the CIA needs to end this. How are we going to bribe countries if we can't get them the money, right? How are we going to do that? So it wasn't so bribery, corruption, all these. So, and also the the Indochina War, France was fighting over there in Vietnam and China, and they needed military guns, food, supplies coming from the ports. They're blocked. How are we going to get them guns to keep the military industrial complex going? And so that is why the CIA allies with the mobs. And it wasn't just the USA, the French intelligence service, they allowed the heroin labs to operate undisturbed for 20 years in Corsica. And the biggest customer, the untouched US with the potential with the world's largest economy and distribution, was opened and ready for business, baby. That is what it was. So I got all these awesome comments here, and I want to read them all. Used to be able to buy heroin syringe kits from Sears catalogs. Hilarious, skeptic. Oh, wow. The one in Pulp Fiction was from Sears. I think we messed up letting Europe back in and out our affairs after the Civil War. Don't get me wrong. I know no war was controlled like most other wars, but the Brits gave the Zionists. Wes, 100. I agree. Wes, I would be interested. Have you ever read? Crap. I can see the photo. It's a book. Not the biggest mistake. Wes, I'll send it to you, but it's basically about the Balfour how Britain built Israel for the Zionists. But okay, continue. So the mafia in America. Everyone loves the mob. Everyone loves the mob. So let's talk about the mob. I love learning about the mob. So originally the mafia in the 1920s, like we mentioned earlier, refused to get into the drugs and the alcohol business. The Sicilians had this honored society code of ethics that they lived by. They punished, killed anybody that sold drugs. And this would all change with Meyer Lansky, the Jewish gangster, and Lucky Luciano. And the heroin trade before this, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat this statistic, but it's just so good. So the heroin trade dominated in the 20s by the Jewish gangsters. Pre-prohibition, the 1890s, typical drug abuser was a middle-class housewife who purchased opiates from the pharmacist. Prohibition changes this to a male-dominated group. And the career of Jewish criminal Waxy Gordon illustrates the relationship between prohibition and the growth of organized crime. So every time the U.S. says, we're going to take a war, we're going to take a stance on drugs, we're going to stop the war on drugs, every action they've ever taken has increased the use of drugs, has increased the amount of money being made. So what does this tell you? Does this tell you that these are bullshit rules, or these are rules they know that will continue drug usage? I guess that's up to you to decide. But just Waxy Gordon, born 1888, 1910, he took over this group called the Fine Gang. They were in the Garment District. 1914, you have the Harrison Narcotics Act. Waxy Gordon becomes a major partner in 5 different cocaine mobs in New York City and Philadelphia. And he would be the kingpin for 15 years, working with Arnold Rothstein, another Jewish gangster, best known for fixing the 1919 World Series. And then in 1917 in New York, you have this group called Kehila, which was a Jewish community agency who tried to listen to this, guys. So this group, this Jewish defense group, Kehila, in 1917, fights back against the press about these horrible lies and allegations that Jewish criminals are dominating the heroin and drug trade. And I mentioned this story. 263 drug dealers in 1917, 83 were Jewish, 23 were Italians, 8 were Irish, 5 were blacks, 3 were Greeks. There is no way that adds up to 263. So I am imagining I put a few wrong numbers there, but you understand the proportions here of what we're going at. And most of the cocaine had the similar numbers. 85% were controlled by Jewish gangsters, 15% Italian gangsters. Now, most of these Jewish syndicates were getting their dope from Asia. Jacob Yasha Katzenberg, he was one of the top smugglers. And again, I had no idea about the Jewish affiliation with international drug trafficking, which I find very interesting. Albert Bourla, who are the CEOs of most of the pharmaceutical companies. So you see, and a lot of these Jewish gangsters, these Albert Bourla and stuff like that, I have to say this because, I have a life and I hate no one. I don't judge people by their cover, their skin. My wife, if you are not aware, is not white. I judge people by their actions and the people they are, so the ADL can say all they want, all these things. More and more people are getting more and more fed up that if you criticize Israel, if you criticize anybody that is of Jewish descent, you are immediately a racist. It's pathetic. It's disgusting. It's a defense tool. We all know how the ADL started. If you don't, the ADL was started because in a small town, a guy named Frank something was accused of doing a ritual murder on a young 8-year-old girl. He drained her blood, raped her, all these things. And the ADL was created to defend him, to say that no, none of this is true. It's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. So the ADL has a long history of lying, deceiving, cheating, and being assholes. Narcotic controls were very lax in the interwar period. You could procure limitless amounts or simply buy legally heroin in Paris and Shanghai. There's a famous story in 1935 when one of Katzenberg's labs blew up, forced him to purchase heroin from a Greek syndicate who was getting their heroin from the Japanese labs. And Japan, it's not about race, it's just about greed. So Japan, I learned about this in my other book. Japan, though, was a major producer of heroin. Why were they a major producer of heroin? Because they had annexed Korea. Korea had all these heroin labs. They were selling the heroin then to Manchurians, to all of Asia, to get these people addicted, to control them, to make money, to fund their military machine. That's all it is. So it's all over the board. I don't want you guys to be thinking I am just talking about Jewish people. The mob. We're going to get into the mob in a second. They take over after this. And between 1935 and 1937, the syndicate got over 650 kilograms for a profit of $519,000 in 1935. Today's money, 200 million, 300 million. Operation, though, was ran by this guy, Louis Lepke, a Jewish gangster in New York. He had over 250 men in his crew. Other famous Jewish gangsters, Bugsy Siegel, Arthur Dutch Schultz. I think he has a funny nickname. Meyer Lansky. And soon it was their time. They took over the bootleg liquor trade, and the major bootleggers in New York in the mid-1920s, we have the same pattern. 10 were Jewish, 5 were Italian, 3 were Irish. And Lansky would be the only one to survive all the arrests, all the indictments and murders that would plague all the other leaders here. And he was the first one to really reach across the aisle to the Italians. So the Jewish domination of the heroin, alcohol, drug trade of the 20s changed in the 1930s as a huge, totally coincidental murder spree happened where all the old dons that had values, blah, 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 rules about drugs, the Italian gangsters, were murdered. And a new generation now took over of Italian mobsters that did not follow those same honor codes. And we're going to see that pattern happen again in a second. Main one being a guy everyone knows, Lucky Luciano. And so Luciano, he modernized the mafia. Okay. He branched out with his buddy, Meyer Lansky, into the heroin and prostitution racket. Yes, I know, Dave. But like I said, you see, this is that you absolutely have to be careful. But this is why I specify this. That defense is failing, in my opinion. That unless you're Ron DeSantis, this anti-Semitic trope, this dog whistling, what have you, it's failing. It's falling apart because more and more people are realizing, no, it's not. I'm not allowed to say that Meyer Lansky was a Jewish gangster, that I have factual evidence that Jewish gangsters controlled the heroin, alcohol, and drug trade in the 20s, that's anti-Semitic, right? No, it's not. But you're absolutely right, though, David. Absolutely right. So anyway, Luciano, he reaches across the aisle. He's the new Don, and he modernizes the mafia. Right prior to this, it had been about all these little cliques, little groups, neighborhoods. So he got 24 of the top dons from the families to form what he called the Commission. And with Prohibition ending, Luciano branched out with Lansky into the heroin and prostitution rackets. So Luciano used heroin to get his prostitutes addicted, pimp them out, control them. And by 1935, Lucky Luciano controlled 235 brothels in New York City with over 1,200 prostitutes. He was bringing in $10 million a year in 35. I converted that to today's money. Lucky Luciano was making over $250 million a year in prostitution. And that's just prostitution. That's just a prostitution. God knows what other money he was making in. So the Sicilian mafia, they eventually would take over the heroin trade. Purity levels dropped significantly. So the Jewish mafia clearly did not cut as much as the Sicilian mob was doing. So I'll give them credit for that. The purer, the better. That's what I always say. And so the Sicilian mob, and whoever asked that question about the shooting up, I think Bud, this was when sniffing was no longer effective. This is when injections, IVing heroin became popular in the mid 30s. So America's modernizing. In 1936, Thomas Dewey indicts Lucky Luciano on 60 counts of forced prostitution. They had him on so many other drug charges, but the public at this time, drugs really weren't that important to them. There was no war on drugs. It was a commodity for their grandparents were buying it at the corner store. Probably many of them in 1935 remember going with their mom to the corner store to buy a bottle of Miracle Cure filled with opium, right? So regardless, they sentenced Luciano to a 30-year drug term, and many of the mob leaders fled the country. And this would be a poor decision for a lot of these mobsters that fled, because Mussolini, who despised the Sicilian mafia, was eviscerating them, declared total war on the mob. Think of the Inquisition, everybody. Multiply that by times 100. Beatings, tortures, murders, kidnappings, you name it. Reducing the mafia to the weakest state they had ever seen in over 100 years. And by the start of World War II, mafia figures had to flee the cities, were only hiding in the mountainous areas of Sicily. Now, how does the mafia recover? How do they recover, guys? How does the mafia build back from this? Well, World War II, the mafia got a new lease on life. And how do they do that? Well, the Office of Naval Intelligence, concerned about the New York waterfront and sabotage, ships were being sunk allegedly. I have an article, I think, hanging up at work about that. It's a hilarious story that makes zero sense. That was pure propaganda. But anyway, so Oni, they hit up the New York District Attorney. They say, hey, could we talk to some mob people? Maybe they can help us that have pull in the unions and the docks. So they call this guy, Joe Sox Lanza. They say, hey, can you help us out? He tries, but he says, I'm not the guy, to be honest, guys. I'm kind of small. That buffering was the ADL. You're probably right, dude. They're always after me. Wes, I always joke with my wife. I am so blessed that my wife isn't white, because if anybody ever says he's a racist, I say, really? You're wrong. Sorry. Good try, buddy. Next time. But yeah. So they call up the mob, and Lanza, he says, I can't do it by myself. He says, but I do have a guy. And so the next day, Office of Naval Intelligence meets with Meyer Lansky, and because Lansky, even though he is the top criminal dog, he's remained kind of, he's not close enough to be prosecuted, really. And he says, no, I got the guy that you need to talk to, which was Luciano. So you can't have the Office of Naval Intelligence openly meeting with Lucky Luciano, right? That's not going to look good in the press. And so they use Meyer Lansky as a middleman. So Lansky calls up Luciano, and as already, so now we can see here, and this started, even with the Virgin Queen, how she worked with pirates, with criminals to increase wealth, power, blah, 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 blah. Well, this is just a continuation of that with sorry, I'm changing my lights here, with the mob, right? So anyway, so they meet up eventually. And the docks want to use Luciano to monitor the docks, also to help set up an allied invasion of the island of Sicily. So he brought all the Sicilian mobsters that knew it very well, oh my gosh, guys, my lights, I think, just went off. No, my battery just started working. Oh, there we go. My battery just started working, and now we got it back. Okay, so yeah, Luciano's going to be their guy, and so we already just talked about that. So yeah, so Luciano, he introduced them to all these mobsters that are in Sicily to do the maps, coastlines, how they're going to infiltrate, how they're going to get out there. So they asked Luciano who's going to help us, and so he introduces them to recent mafia characters who had to flee to Sicily in years previous, or mobsters that despised Mussolini, despised the fascism, and who destroyed their gang as guides on the island. And so then they eventually would take over the main Italian secret headquarters of Mussolini. There was a safe there. They blew up the safe. In the safe, all of the war plans are in this safe. And it ruins Mussolini. It destroyed the Axis. I mean, not just that, but that was the beginning of the end. And so the Mussolini's Italy is crumbling now, right? It's gone for. So do I identify friendly mob guys? They would all wear a yellow scarf with an L on it, which obviously probably stood for Luciano. So the dons of the mafia in Sicily, they would even be made mayors in many of the towns across Sicily. So things are looking great, right? For America war in Italy, right? Wrong. During all of this, there's a growing communist party taking hold, doubling membership towards the end of the war. Sicily was their base, and they knew that if they could keep the allies knew if we could keep the mafia in power, we can keep communism in check and not growing, because we'll use the mob to beat the shit out of the communists. So the mafia is a natural ally again. And another name you might know, Vito Genovese. He, all of the mafia movies, they'll tell you rats, snitches, blah, blah, blah. Well, Genovese was one of the key collaborators with the United States government. He acted as an interpreter for the Allied army in Italy. He left America in 1937 to go to Naples to avoid indictment, started working with the military, and he got rewarded. He was able to, things that fell off the truck of supplies of the Americans, he would sell that, weapons, food, what have you, to people in Sicily of stolen goods and all over southern Italy. And he was even using U.S. military trucks. They were allowing him to use their trucks. So again, we see the connection between the mafia and the United States government. And he would eventually be arrested, brought back to Brooklyn for a murder charge. What do you think happened? Witnesses just didn't show up. Charges dropped. How lucky for Vito Genovese, who eventually also would be key with the CIA in laundering money, because he opened a bunch of pizza shops in Jersey, Philly, and New York. And that's how the CIA was laundering a lot of this drug stolen money through the Genovese crime family. And all the black market items he was getting from the military, he was giving them a percentage of the profit he was making. But this alliance ensured the mob would support the political wishes of the U.S. no matter what. He would stop communist rallies. He would beat up communist leaders, kill communist leaders. So again, the Allied occupation and interference with the mob, which could have destroyed the mafia, destroyed international drug trafficking, actually restarted their power after being literally decimated. And they even returned, listen to this, guys. They returned the guns from the guns that Mussolini stole from the mafia, returned the guns to the mafia. So Lucky Luciano in Europe. So in 1946, Luciano gets lucky once again. For all his help, his 30 to 60-year sentence dropped. They said, though, but we got to deport you. Okay, we can't make a big show of it. And to either deport him to Italy to continue rebuilding the mob and the heroin trade, making more connections. And though the U.S. tried to deny that he helped them, one guy was a total idiot who wrote letters detailing Luciano's help, who was like a big CIA or OSS guy, which solidified the case that proved Luciano was willingly, openly, knowingly working with the United States government. Governor Dewey, Thomas, who arrested him 10 years earlier, was quoted saying, "Oh, Luciano provided critical information." And the U.S. also deported 100 other mafiosos, giving Luciano a squad to help needed to restart the international dope trade and the mafia. And the syndicate built by Luciano from Sicily would be the comprehensive organization trafficking the OSS, the CIA needed, and would be successful for decades to come. He helped raise the 20,000 addicts at the close of the war. By 1960, there was 60,000 addicts in 1952. So in 6 years, 200% increase of drug addicts, 150,000 heroin addicts by 1965. So in 20 years, we went from 20,000 to 150,000. And at first, the heroin that Luciano and the mob was bringing over here was legally made heroin by a respected pharmaceutical company in Italy, and they were just diverting supplies. Over 700 kilos of pure dope would be diverted, which would eventually lead to tightening regulations in Italy. But Luciano was prepared. I mean, these guys, if anything, they're brilliant. He had been establishing a new system to use, using labs in Marseille. He's getting the opium from the Middle East, from Lebanon, and who was protecting the raw opium, transporting it to Turkey. So Lebanon, Turkey, or Turkey to Lebanon, Lebanon to Sicily, where fishing trawlers would get the goods that were dropped in the ocean, brought on shore to Luciano's labs, which would be soon moved to Marseille. And why were they moved again? We'll get to that reason in a second. Then, with Luciano connections, he would ship the product through a maze of international routes to get to the United States. And Meyer Lansky, was the man on the ground in the U.S. He's coordinating with the Trafficante family. We're going to get to them. Cuba ties, Florida ties. And for 20 years, Luciano, Trafficante, and Lansky dominated, controlled, ran the American drug trafficking organization. Why? Because they were federal informants, allies, accomplices. And now I never knew this. And I heard about the mobsters and their ties to Cuba, but pre-revolution in Cuba, pre-1959, was mafioso city. Lansky owned 60 casinos. Luciano was a frequent visitor. The Caribbean was the place for the dope game because there was poor, bribery, easy, lax laws on drugs. And I don't want to get too deep into this story, but there was another Jewish drug dealer, a guy named Harold Meltzer, and he was a Luciano-esque type guy, an entrepreneur, or I guess more Meyer Lansky since he was Jewish. But so he didn't want to be a part of this crew. They already established that he would be the top dog. So he goes down to Mexico. He starts making connection. He gets loans from people, all that kind of stuff. The CI's black tar budget. Love it, bud. I love it. But what was Harold Meltzer's biggest mistake? He had no ties to the military intelligence, like everybody else that was making a big of it. You see what they do? They say, "Oh, Lucky, look at him. He's so good at what he does. He's so secretive." No, just like El Chapo, he's not a mastermind. He worked just like Pablo Escobar, not a mastermind. He worked with the federal government or American federal government. So regardless, it's a long story. It ends horrible for Harold. He either gets killed or imprisoned. And I just brought this story up because I wanted to show you that international drug trafficking post World War II at this time, it wasn't a free for all. It wasn't like, oh, it's so easy. Just bring the heroin into the US. No, it was who you knew, just like it is today. Just the same way tons of kilos of drugs get into America. It's not because they just slip by, guys. It's not because they have submarines. I'm sure some of it's that, but it's because they have agreements with the CIA, with the OSS. I mean, dude, I think I talked about this last episode, but there's stories of how the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, they're all the dope is coming from Asia, all of it at later on after in the 80s. And where do you think that all their agents were stationed? If all 90% of a heroin's coming from Southeast Asia, you would put people there, right? They had not a single officer in the place that 90% of Americans' heroin was coming from. Does that make sense to you? Does that sound like a group that wants to stop what's going on? But anyway, so now it's the Sicilian mob. So that was how it was built. So we talked about Lansky. He starts the commission, and after this, it just continues to grow. Eventually, even Luciano, that Lansky, that whole crew, they die, imprisoned, whatever. And a younger group takes over after that. The Gottis and all these kind of things. And these people, it seems each values and cores and traditions, they tend to you lose them over time, even in the mafia. So Marseille connection. So I've seen the French connection before. I never understood why this was. I know Corsica simply from Napoleon. Oh, what's up, Dubai? Damn, dude, what time is it in Dubai? Thanks for coming. So Turkey, Italy, America would dominate heroin for 20 years. But one change happened in the 1950s. And I alluded this to it earlier, but this diversion method that they relied on for so many years, that would be the Marseille Corsican syndicates for their drug supplies. Why, you may wonder, why did Luciano pick them to do this? Well, totally by chance, of course. The Corsican syndicates had recently gained an insane amount of power in France. Now, why would that be? Well, the reason why that was because, like I said, a lot of them allied with the Nazis. The leaders were dead, all those things. Well, the CIA gave them a call and said, hey, you guys out of jobs? We got some ideas for you. So they start using the Corsican mob as strike breaking because of another growing communist group, just like in Sicily in Corsica. So Meyer Lansky made the trip to Marseille. And when he returned, the U.S. labs began, the heroin labs started popping up all over Marseille in 1951. And it became Americans' heroin laboratory. Through its port, Marseille was instrumental in sending supplies to Europe. It was filled with blue-collar workers. It was a communist stronghold, and home to many brutal strikes that hurt France over the years. And the Corsican Mafia was the perfect counterweight to these powerful communist labor unions. The French fascists used them to battle the communists in the 30s. The Nazis used them to spy on the communists in World War II. And then the CIA paid them to break the communist strikes in 1947 and 1950. And the Corsicans worked well with the Sicilians. Like I said, both islands, family-oriented, both conquered many times by different groups, not trusting of outsiders. And so why the Corsicans, they were so good at cooking dope is because they traveled all over the French colonies, Indochina specifically, where heroin's very prevalent. And so they learned there, brought that knowledge back to Corsica. So from 1948 to 1972, the Corsicans dominated the U.S. heroin market through the alliance with the Sicilian Mafia. And much like the Sicilians, the original Corsicans, they made heroin solely and only for export. They did not allow the drugs to be sold in France, which allowed them to kind of just continue operating. Not only were they bribing French politicians, the economy was in the shitter then, but it wasn't affecting France. It wasn't an issue. So 80% of the heroin coming into America was coming from the Corsican Mafia. They hid their labs in luxurious villas in the downtown, all everywhere. I mean, there was something like 78 heroin labs in Marseille, in a little port town, for 20 years. And the Corsicans, they're not as organized as the Sicilian mob, though, right? But this would all change until two characters came on the scene. Prior to that, it was just like small families, neighborhoods. But the two guys were Carbone and Spirito. And so Spirito, during the 20s, 30s, fascism was rising all over Europe. And these two gangsters saw their chance to get a foot in the door with the upcoming power players. So they were used to beat back the communists and socialists from protesting the speeches of these fascist leaders in Corsica and France. And though their violence did fail, a socialist mayor would win the Corsican election, but this did not slow their power growth. So they didn't have to wait long, because in 1940, when France was occupied, the Nazis needed connections to the underground. And these are the two perfect leaders to help collaborate with. So it was a win-win-win. They gave up their enemies, the commies, the socialists, eliminating competition, eliminating the people chasing them, solidifying power. Now, their win streak would end when the Nazis lost. Many tried to escape to America, but the next generation of Corsican mobsters were here and ready to rock. And that's where we go to the Guarini brothers. So Corsica was split post-war. You had the communists, who have been very organized since due to the war. You had the non-communists or gangsters, which had no setup, no organizations. And then you also had the socialists. And in 1946, Corsica elects a communist mayor who creates a new secret police unit called the CRS, which basically became the bane of the Corsican underworld's of their existence, right? And the CIA isn't liking the growing power of communism. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. And they're gaining in one of the world's most influential ports, Marseille. So in 1947, there's another general election. A guy, Charles de Gaulle, who was anti-communist, he started gaining seats in France. He had enough clout to unseat the communist mayor of Corsica, and they elect a conservative guy, Michel Carlini. And his first act, Carlini, was to raise tram fees. Marseille, post-war, just like much of Western Europe, was utterly destroyed. People were broke. Inflation, food inflation, 25, 30% inflation on food. Longer hours. They were getting paid 65% less than they were pre-war. It was terrible. It was terrible. So a lot of anger, a lot of resentment in Corsica. So you could see why communists were growing. But so this new guy, that's his first, is to raise the subway, the train fees. Well, what this did was immediately caused a huge, huge issue with the communists. Huge protest broke out, refusing to work the docks. They would beat up people trying to get on the trains just to get to work. And they weren't, totally wrong. The American economists, we were the ones that told France, keep your wages low. It'll help you skyrocket your economy. I'm not an economist. I don't know if that's as true, but many newspapers in 1947 in France said that the difference between the haves and the have-nots in 1947 was worse than during the French Revolution. I mean, I hope that gives you an idea of just how bad it was in Corsica. Regardless, though, big protests, communists, a fight break out, a commie gets killed. There's lots of this story. The ending is what we care about. And the Guarini bros, they're called in with their gang to come in, save the politicians and the protests, and disperse the crowd using any underworld means necessary. And so a few months later, 3 more million French workers went on strike, recovering the French economy, and it's totally paralyzed. So now, again, why does the CIA... One second, guys. Sorry about that. Thought my animals were being bad. So why would the CIA care that there's this huge strike? Well, like I mentioned earlier, that the Marshall Plan had passed. How are we going to bribe all these new upcoming democracies that we don't want to turn communist if we can't get them supplies out? So the CIA says we need something to end this 3 million large strike from these damn commies. And so who are we going to align with? Are we going to align with the communists? Can we convince them? Are we going to align with the Gaullists? Are we going to align with the who are very weak, or the socialists? CIA, they picked the socialists. It's the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is an ally of mine, right? So whether, and we saw this, whether, the CIA, OSS, they recruited Gestapo, Nazis, brutal, vicious murderers, psychopaths, on and on, to work for the United States, right? They don't care about morals. They don't care about your past. As long as you're on the same goal kind of as ours, the CIA will work with you. So as the French communist attacks kept interfering with the Marshall Plan, the newly created CIA created one of its first covert operations. And so they started channeling funds to the socialist leader to oust the communist-dominated group. And now in the papers, everyone are like, dude, where are you getting all this cash, bro? Like, you're a social. Why are you having $2 million? Where'd you get this? And what does he say? He says, oh, actually, we're getting the money. Oh, no, it's not bribery, guys. The $3 million that I just got from the United States. It's actually from trade unions in the United States that we're working with. They're going to send us money and we're sending them supplies. Hilarious, right? And, but so it gives us a little foreshadowing here, right? That the CIA, they don't care what side of the aisle you are on, because the side they're on this neoliberal, corporate socialist political spectrum. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. So they don't care what you are, right? So they get a few people in power. They give all this money to the socialists, and gangsters are being let out of. Then they start letting the mobsters out of prison. Clubs that had been shut, these gangster clubs that had been shut down because the communists were being reopened. That secret communist police force was being gutted. They were firing anyone that was maybe a communist, that was affiliated with the communist, that was in any way related, blah, 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 to the communist. And then once they got the CRS gone, which was the biggest thorn in the Corsican Mafia side, now the mob had full reign. They were beating the shit out of any protesters with unrestrained violence, because they're not going to get arrested. They're not going to get in trouble. To help you understand this, guys, 80,000 people in Marseille were protesting at one time. 80,000. And the CIA even started using psychological warfare to slow the communist growth. So the CIA, they supply the Guarini brothers with money, guns, to beat up the picket lines, weapons, cash, protection from the law, whatever you name it. And then the psychological warfare aspect, pamphlets, radio broadcasts, posters, all these things to push anti-communism, to push people not to strike. And Americans told the Corsicans that they were going to take back the 65,000 pounds of flour that are stuck in your harbor because your communists won't let us get in. And people are starving in Corsica. This hunger with the Guarini violence, it did its job. The Marseille workers abandoned the strike in 1947, and then 87 boxcars arrived carrying flour, milk, sugar, fruit, and the people cheered, waving American flags. And now the Greeners, they're gaining enough power from their role in smashing these strikes. They emerge as the new leaders of the Corsican underworld. But again, this is the only beginning. In 1950, you have another communist strike that shut down the ports. And the French were already fighting at this point Ho Chi Minh. And obviously the communists, they refused to be sending weapons to one of their gods, one of their commie gods in Vietnam. So they started a strike again. So what happens again? Well, the CIA, they called the Guarini brothers. They send $2 million. They send Italian mercenaries and Corsican gangsters and inspire anybody who wants to get paid to break this strike. And so the leaders of the strike send his boys to try and stop the scabs. The commies did. They were beaten the hell out and thrown into the harbor. They don't stand a chance against the CIA. And quickly the protest was meaningless. The dock was done. Smooth sailing. The protesters, the commies, they're now out of jobs. And the Greery brothers once again saved the day. And in 1951, the first heroin lab, after meeting with Lansky, was opened in Marseille, where they would maintain power until 1967. At its peak in 1965, Corsican chemists making heroin number 4 had over 25 labs with outputs of over 150 kilos per month. So 25, 150. What is that, guys? Who can do some math here for me in the chat? So if you have 25 labs, they're producing, we'll just say 100 kilos per 100 kilograms, 2.2 pounds. So 100, so 200, 300. So about 350 pounds of heroin was coming out of one lab a month. So 20 lab, 300. So over 6,000, 7,000 pounds of pure uncut heroin was coming out of Marseille in 1965. You don't get pure heroin when you get it in the US. It's been cut to shit. You'd be lucky if you get 10 to 15%. So 5 tons of pure heroin came into the United States. 5 tons in 1965. And just like the fate of the original Sicilian mobsters, the Greery brothers, who had banned selling heroin in France, were eventually ousted, and a newer generation took hold. And these were some subordinates, and they had a rival as well, this guy, Michael Francisci. And I wondered if he was loosely based on the guy in the Peaky Blinders, because Francisci, he was a war hero. He won all these medals of courage and valor in World War II. And so these two, the Guarinis and Francisci, they coexisted for many years. He was more gambling. They were more drugs. They were the clear top dog, but times are changing. So a huge war ensued in the 60s, ending with the Guarinis' arrest and murders. And the CIA now had new partners, basically is what happened. They didn't need them anymore. And that's what they do, just like with Saddam Hussein, just like with Osama bin Laden, just like with any gosh darn dictator that we install. Once they serve their purpose, we're going to kill you. That's what happens. So now you have two main Corsican groups. You have the Venturi Guarini associates, who aligned with their predecessors, with the Socialist Party, and who were the politicians' bodyguards. And then you had Francisci, who was running with the Gaullist Republican Party. And the Gaullist Party almost crumbled in 1968, but the CIA stepped in because they said, we really don't like socialists. And they said, well, why don't you use your gangster friends to do the stuff that your police can't do? And so they created a 5,000-man unit of gangsters who basically just beat the shit out of anyone causing issues. They were legit police officers, like they had badges, but gangsters. And to prove that, in 1970, 10 SAC officers were arrested. This is the new Gaullist Secret Service were key in organizing the smuggling operation. They got caught with kilos and kilos of smuggling. And in 1971, a great story, there's an undercover narcotics agent posing as a mafioso. He meets with a Marseille heroin syndicate rep in a New York City hotel room, offering to purchase 150 kilos of heroin. The Corsican gangsters go home. They say, dude, we got a big order coming, baby. And he's paying top dollar. What an idiot. What an idiot. And so they go home, they're packing it all up, and they get a call from a friend. And he says, guys, you're being tricked. And the gangsters say, well, why do you say that? How do you know that? And he said, Colonel so-and-so passed this info along to me. Who was Colonel so-and-so? He was one of the highest ranking officers of the French version of the CIA. So the SDCE, that was what they were called, SDECE. They finally get exposed in 1971 when a New Jersey prosecutor indicted a guy, Colonel Fournier, who was one of the top agents, for conspiring to smuggle 45 kilos in the United States. They found a Volkswagen at the New Jersey waterfront with all these kilos registered to another officer, Roger De Louet. And when arrested, Louet admitted he's a courier for Colonel Fournier. So regardless, with all these connections, all with the ending of the Guarinis, heroin was now being sold in France and now became a national problem. As rules, values, all these things change. Now it's important. So now by 1972, every 15 out of 1,000 Frenchmen addicted to heroin, they're being rejected to the military because of this. Marseille alone had an addict population of 20,000. Marseille, a little port on a little island. That was how many addicts we had in post-World War II in America. 20,000. And France was forced to drop their blasé attitude and expanded police units because of this. And then it also helped that these steps were being supported by Dick Nixon's war on drugs. And he produced a huge assault on the Marseille heroin industry. He was giving money. Nixon was giving money to the Turks to stop producing heroin and opium production. Raid after raid, arrest after arrest. The once top for 30 years heroin producer of the world crumbled. And this was the decline of the European heroin trade. And we're almost done here. We got one page left here. So the new Corsican mafia, they did not have the need for the connections of their predecessors. They tried putting labs in Italy, caught. Every trick in the book, caught. Forcing them to ally even more with the Sicilian mafia, which was great timing because just like how the Corsican gangsters took over, the same thing happened with the Sicilian mob after an 8-year battle in 1955 to 1963. Both the same thing happens with these honored societies, the rules, codes of ethics that the old gangsters lived by, done. And the new mafia was inspired by the business methods of and wanted to be like Lucky Luciano. So these poor peasants in Sicily, they all migrated to the cities. Now they don't need the mafia for protection. The mafia dons follow these people into the cities, and this becomes the wars over territory, area, all that stuff like that. So regardless, the European heroin trade is done. Turkish opium fell from 8,000 kilos in 1969 to 200 kilos in 73. So no more heroin, right? It's over. It's done for. Heroin's over with. We did it. Nixon did it. No. The CIA, they got to keep making their money, baby. And what are they going to do? They found a better place to use their smuggling. So Luciano, he dies in 1962. Lansky would become his successor. He retired to Israel. My eyes are rolling if you are just listening. And Vito Genovese, who was in prison for 15 years, he had the responsibility, or he was done. So the responsibility fell onto Santo Trafficante Jr. Trafficante was in this group. Okay, he was a Cuban. He was a super effective crime leader. Hence why nobody knows his name. I never knew his name before this. He didn't drive the Cadillacs. He didn't have the fur coats. He didn't have the diamonds. He was an old school Don. And he never fully trusted Luciano and Lansky. So he never joined the commission. He stayed out of all that drama, out of the fight, just stayed in his lane in Florida and heroin. And brilliantly, he was the boss. He never saw, never touched, never anything with the dope, just managed the money. His organization was so airtight that the feds said it was a lost cause. We're never going to get inside this. And his territory, Trafficante, was the Florida, the Caribbean. And again, like I said, closely aligned with Lansky. Someone tries to open up a rival casino in Cuba by Lansky. They die mysteriously. They probably killed themselves with 3 shots to the head. You know how that happens all the time. And then the Cuban Revolution in 1959 caused Trafficante to lose his casinos in Havana, but there was a silver lining. All of his employees from Cuba became refugees that came to Miami. So now Trafficante, the new leader of the heroin trade, has a whole new crew that is virtually unknown to the feds, unknown to Interpol, unknown to American agents. And with this crew, Trafficante opens up new trade routes through South America to smuggle dope into Miami. In 1970, a huge drug bust was made. 139 arrests happened. All 5 ringleaders were Spanish-speaking. 3 were Cubans residing in Miami. And heroin seizures increased 100% in 1971. So with the new couriers, distributors, the mafia still needed to find an alternative source of a morphine base because they had a few options. But Southeast Asia was looking promising. Mexicans' low-grade brown tar heroin wasn't good enough to produce that fine white powder. India and the Middle East had local opium smuggling, but it was no connection with international syndicates since the British left. But Southeast Asia, Vietnam, what was going on there? Started growing 70% of the world's illicit opium. Chinese labs, Hong Kong, producing the purest dope in the world. And the Corsican syndicates, because the Indochina Wars had been based in Vietnam and Laos for decades. And they had connections. They had the docks. They had the labs. And this was the best choice. So Trafficante goes on over there to Southeast Asia, just had Lansky had done when he met with Corsican leaders. And in 1968, a new trade route was opened. And this was Southeast Asia, which would become the Golden Triangle. So maybe we'll do the one more episode after this. But the point of this show, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Dan, thanks for chat. I'm so glad we had more people watching tonight. I'm so glad my wife convinced me to do it live again. So I'm sorry if you listened to this twice. Hopefully you learned something new. But the point of the matter that I'm trying to make of this as I sign off here, because I have to go eat dinner, is that the international drug trafficking, human trafficking are billion, trillion-dollar a year industries. There is no economic downturn. There is no what have you. To think that the CIA wouldn't be involved with that, wouldn't be corrupted by that, wouldn't be using that cash, wouldn't be using those connections, it's laughable. It's laughable. The warfare, we will never see a war like World War II again. This is the war that we do now. And it's usually against our own people, right? Drugs are something that the reason why they're illegal, it's not because they care about you. It's because if they became legal, CIA is going to be out of a lot of cash and a lot of money, billions, if not trillions, right? So that's why the drug game is the way it is. That's why it's not stopping anytime soon. That's why it's the big push of psychedelics, the big push of, oh, drugs don't hurt anybody, blah, blah, blah. And in many ways, I agree. Prohibition, all these things never solved anything. If you look at the statistics, it actually only made it worse if it was as opposed to being legal. But having said that, if you want a strong country, you want a formidable community, group force, low crime, you take the exact opposite route that many of these people did to stop the heroin trade. And like I said, this topic is so near and dear to my heart because it ruined my life for 10 years. And it kills family members, friends. And the saddest part is it's not because of that's just the way the world is. It's because our government is behind it. Our government is behind it. And that is why after Vietnam War, where does opium production go next? The Middle East. What happens in the Middle East? We have a war there. What happens again? Opium production decreases when the Taliban takes over. Oh, the Taliban did 9/11. Opium production increases again. It went something from like 100 pounds to back to 6,500 kilos of heroin the moment the U.S. took over. So I would make the argument that opium is a huge role in destroying or the reason why we go into wars in certain countries and areas. And yeah, so I think we're going to do a part 3 of this. The last one, we're going to talk about just how the same exact tactics being used by the CIA were used by the British, were used by other countries to dominate, control, destroy all these countries and to make millions of dollars. And like what we already mentioned, so the Astor family, oh no, they killed the Astors on the Titanic because he wanted to stop the Federal Reserve. Oh, really? I don't know if you know this, but the Astor family was one of the leading families of opium trafficking in the world before it was illegal. Something in America, they were the top 5 biggest opium traffickers in the world or in America. But no, they cared about you guys. They didn't want the Federal Reserve to happen. They wanted a good, honest economy, right? So anyway, I had to redo it. I was awake today. I really enjoyed talking about it. So I'm glad my wife made me do it. We'll do part 3 possibly, or I'll switch a book. I'll decide. I love the next chapter is great, but I've kind of talked about it before. So we have even more people watching tonight. Skeptic, Dave, Dan, thank you, Bud. You rock, bud. Thanks for coming. Wes, as always. Annika, thank you. And yeah, so we'll do another show soon. I have my notes actually already done for part 3, so I'll decide what I do here. But yeah, we might switch topics. We'll figure it out, guys. But thanks for listening. I love you all. God bless. I'm gonna go eat my pork, and you have a great night. I'm Jack Allen at Kojak Podcast. I have a baby list. If you want to buy baby unnamed something, I'll post it in the show notes. And my wife put a bunch of little toys up and stuff like that. Or if you guys want to go crazy and buy a funny history onesie, I bought a Napoleon World Tour shirt for my little buddy that's growing. So if you do want to do something like that, you don't need to donate to the show, Venmo or whatever, guys. The economy sucks. If you really want to, if the show you learn a lot, it really means a lot to you, I would be honored. I'm so amazed at the people that have donated, but please don't feel I don't do this for that. But if you want to buy baby Allen a gift or a little shirt, an infant or a towel, I don't know, whatever babies buy, that would mean more to me than anything. So I love you guys. Take care. God bless. I'm going to go eat dinner. I'm Jack Allen. Follow me at Kojak Podcast. Peace, everybody. Bye. Boston Bruins. Love you, Dave. Peace, buddy.